Hello, I'm Jim Blake. I'm a software developer. VitroLib runs as a Java web application when you install Tomcat. The installation process will store the executable code here. You should not need to change the contents of this directory. Change them as needed. Some of these settings will be changed by editing a file before you start VitroLib. Other settings are changed interactively within the VitroLib. All of VitroLib is determined when you install MySQL, and you probably will not need to know its location. The contents of the database are stored in a form that is particular to VitroLib and should not be modified using any other tool. Now let's talk about the questions that you need to answer before proceeding with the installation. I'll list the questions, and then I'll show you my answers for this demonstration. First are the home directory is less than half a gigabyte. Next, the location of Tomcat. This is decided when you install Tomcat. When you install VitroLib, the installation script will use this value to put Then, the database parameters. The database must have the VitroLib itself. Again, this should not be confused with the Linux root control within VitroLib. The root account will see data that would otherwise be private. Seeing this data can be useful, or it can be confusing. One or more admin accounts. After that, the admin accounts can be used for all administrative tasks. Finally, you will need to choose a default namespace. This will be used for any URI. Your ingested data will already contain URIs, each with its own namespace. VitroLib may need to create URIs to support that editing, and that's when this namespace is used. You should choose this namespace to match your server URL if you want VitroLib to respond to requests for linked data. While you are testing your server URL, test.vitrolib.mydomain.edu:8080/vitrolib/. However, most installations will add an Apache front end when they go into production and will use URL rewriting, so the server appears at http://vitrolib.mydomain.edu/. Whatever you choose for the base of your namespace, you must then add the word individual followed by a slash for successful linked data responses. Don't worry, VitroLib includes a tool that will change the default. If you have written code to create data for ingest, you will probably need to modify. These are how I will answer the questions in this demonstration. Look at the locations of the distribution directory and the home directory. My system administrator created a directory path called /cul and asked me to put my source code in /cul/source and my data in /cul/data. You will probably use different locations. As I said, the location of Tomcat was determined when I installed Tomcat on my system. The database settings are simple, exist. That's not a problem. This will only be used when I log in to the simple and assumes that I will have the domain of vitrolib.cornell.edu. Again, the namespace must end with the word individual and a slash. On an Amazon Web Services instance created for this purpose. If you are using a different environment, your experience may be different, but I'll try to walk you through the differences. AWI Linux uses Yum as a package manager. Other versions of Linux use RPM or apt-get. You will need to change the commands that I show to suit the package manager you use. I prefer not to use the root account, but I will be executing some commands that require root privilege. My system administrator has set up my account. These are the software packages that VitroLib requires. We'll install all 5 of them and then install VitroLib itself. So let's get started. The first requirement is Java, since VitroLib is written and can run in either the Oracle JDK or OpenJDK. I can find out whether Java is installed on my machine like this. I see that it is installed, but it is version 1.7. I can install version 1.8 like this. Choosing the developer's version means that I get the compiler as well as the runtime. Okay, and so Java is installed. By the way, remember that the commands that I'm using are all available at the website that I mentioned earlier. So you see here the commands that I've just typed in. As we progress through the installation, some commands will require some modification to suit your particular locations on your machine. Next, we'll need Git in order to fetch the source code from the VitroLib repositories. Let's see if it's already installed. I see that it is installed. If Git were not installed on my machine, I could install it this way. Again, in this case, there should be nothing to do. Nothing to do. Now, Maven. The VitroLib than the Java or Git installations, because for some reason Maven is not available in the repositories that are distributed with AWI Linux. You can find out whether you have the same situation like this. See, there are some machines, some matches with packages that have the word Maven in their descriptions, but we did not find Maven itself. If on your machine you do see a match for Apache Maven, you're in luck. As for me, I will need to create a reference to the repository where the Maven is stored, so Yum can find it. I will need to enter these two commands. They will tell Yum how to find the repository where Maven is stored. And again, I'm looking at the bit.ly site mentioned earlier. And paste it into the terminal. The second command, copy it and paste it. So that was annoying, but now Yum should be able to find Maven. Sure enough, there's Apache Maven. And we can proceed with the installation. That's okay. If you noticed, Maven installed Java 1.7, and now if I check, I see that one use Java 1.8 for the runtime. And Java 1.8 for the compiler. So I can see the defaults are both 1.8, and I'm ready to move ahead. VitroLib will run under Tomcat, so let's install that next. Remember, I'm using Amazon's AWI Linux for this demonstration. Your mileage may vary. To have its own account on your machine and its own group. So we start by creating a group named Tomcat. And a username Tom. My system administrator has already created a Tomcat account, but you may need one. A Tomcat user, I find that my system administrator has already created one. Unfortunately, I also wanted this command, the -G option. Okay, that looks good. Now I can continue. Okay. I can start Tomcat like this. And I can stop it in essentially the same way. Okay. Now you may be wondering, do I need to have a Tomcat account on my machine? Why can't I just install Tomcat in my own space and run it under my own account? And the answer, of course, is that you can. When I'm developing for VitroLib, most servers use a specific Tomcat account, as I've shown. Tomcat will need to read when it runs. It will also create directories that Tomcat will need to write in. So the account that runs the installation should be the same account that runs Tomcat. Otherwise, you will run into problems with the file permissions. Again, and have a look at the command line. You don't need to change any of Tomcat's settings in order to run VitroLib. However, in particular, you can use this file to change the settings of a Java virtual machine. So let's go there. Look at the files that are in this, but they are in the Tomcat group. When we create the settings file, we'll configure the group ID, permissions, desired options. Boy, I think it would have been easier for me to have copied and pasted that from the list of commands, which you might want to do. Gigabytes of memory to start and 2 gigabytes as a maximum, and save it. The change won't take effect until I restart Tomcat. And there we go. Hey. A bunch of text scrolls by, but you're looking for that last line that says starting MySQLD, and if that shows up, then the installation was successful. It looks okay. Now, if I were setting this up for a development environment, like on my laptop, then I could choose to call this good. But for any kind of production server, you'll want to secure the installation, so let's walk through it. If you scroll back through that text installation, you'll see the record. Okay. Now, as I go through the script, each step is described and you're given the choice of whether to proceed. In all cases, the default choice is the more secure one. Okay, so there is no current password for root. That's the MySQL. Again, this is a demonstration. In a production environment, I would use a more secure. There we go. Okay, do I want to remove anonymous user access? Well, of course I do. Do I want to allow root access from other servers? Well, no, I don't. Should I remove the test database? Why not? And finally, do I want these changes to take effect now rather than waiting for the next restart? Of course I do. Very good. You should keep track of that. All of the required software components. Let's do one more thing before installing VitroLib. Let's talk about file access privileges. In a production environment, it's good to be more formal. In particular, motion process. That would work, but the Tomcat user account would need to. This slide shows the relationships between the three main directories and the processes that access them. When we run VitroLib, Tomcat will read from and write to its web apps directory and to the VitroLib home directory. This slide shows that I will create the VitroLib distribution directory in my account, but I will assign read-write access to any account in the Tomcat group. When I run VitroLib, access to the MySQL database. All right, I think we're finally ready. The next step is to download the VitroLib code. The code will go into the distribution directory, which you selected as one of your installation answers. Let's check that. For me, this directory is /cul/src/VitroLib_distribute. Because the parent directory is owned by root. Ownership on the directory to the Tomcat group, and I'll set permissions on the directory so anyone in the Tomcat group can read it or write to it. I tell it that any files and subdirectories in this directory should inherit its group ID. Well, excellent. Now let's go to the directory. And look at the permit that. Now I can get the source code from GitHub. The source technology behind VitroLib, and the other holds VitroLib itself. We will get We'll want to do some fiddling to make sure the source code is accessible to any user in the Tomcat user group. Then, when we run the installation, make changes to the source or pull a new version from Git, the new files will be configured properly. Okay, let's do those 4 commands again with the VitroLib directory. Create new source directories. And now we have the source code installation. Let's stay in the same directory and make a copy of the example set. We will make 2 changes to this file, telling VitroLib where those are. Home directory, Tomcat. Remember that you chose a location for the home directory when we began this process, and that your system chose where to put Tomcat when you installed it. So, we put those 2. Okay, that looks good. And make Tomcat the owner. Oops, excuse me. Okay, now let's make Tomcat the owner. Okay, now we're ready to run the installation script. To the Tomcat user ID, so Tomcat will own all of the files that are created, third-party software packages that VitroLib requires. If you run it again, it should. Okay, I love to see that at the end where it says scripts that were run, they all say success next to them, and finally that build success near the end. We need to create the database within MySQL. Remember at the beginning and a password to go with that username. Let's give all that information to MySQL. Start MySQL. And create the database. I decided to use VitroLib as the database name. And give access to the database to my chosen user account. And this creates the user account at the same time. Let me just double check those values. VitroLib user, VitroLib pass. Yeah, okay, no surprises there. And quit from MySQL is completely installed. Hooray. But if you start it in a setup file, This file determines which components of VitroLib are used on your installation. The reason I say that it's an annoyance is that 99% of the example file, like this. Again, we're using the sudo command to act as the Tomcat user because Tomcat owns the VitroLib home directory. Now to the runtime properties file. Let's make a copy of the example. Okay, let's refer back to the choices we made earlier. We'll need to set the default namespace. Yes. Looks good. We need to change the database settings. Well, actually, the database name. Let's just double check. VitroLib user, VitroLib pass. Looks good. Now, for this installation, I'm going to assume that we settings. If you do have an available server and you want to handle accounts management by sending email, you should set these to the appropriate values for your site. Okay, that's all we need to set. If you scroll down in the file, you'll see many other options, but the default values should be fine. Save this. And we are finally ready to long since VitroLib takes several minutes to start, especially the first time. To test Tomcat earlier. How will you know whether VitroLib has started successfully? Well, just direct your browser to VitroLib's home page. By default, Tomcat listens for connections on port 8080, and we need to specify the VitroLib path in the URL. On my installation, I don't know the name of my server, but I do know the IP address. So I will direct the browser to http http://10.8080 VitroLib/. My first thought was that I should get this fixed before finishing the video, but then I thought it would be a useful illustration of some troubleshooting techniques. So let's see what we find. There's the timeout. First thing I should tell you is that when VitroLib starts successfully on my machine for the first time, it takes about 6 minutes to get started, and so a request up to that point will time out. But let me find out whether it has started successfully. So I'm going to become Tomcat and look at the Tomcat logs. There's the log. Let me look at the VitroLib. Again, the first time through I would see more messages here. Context has been initialized on all listeners, which would suggest, well, that there are no problems. Let's try this. And it's possible in this case, and it turns out to be the case, that in fact port 8080 on my AWS machine is protected by the firewall and is not open. So when I point my browser to this VitroLib instance, I don't see anything and the request times out. Well, what can I do to assure myself that this is in fact working? One thing, I've already looked at the log, so let's try curl. So then I will try to access this. We'll look at the headers for the moment. Of course, from this perspective, the page is at localhost. I want to get that slash on the end, otherwise I'll just get a redirect. Boom. So we have a 200 status code, which is success. And so it appears that Tomcat is responding to the request for the VitroLib homepage. Again, that was just the headers, because if you ask for the entire page, it's a little like drinking from the fire hose, but there it is, and this is all that came back. So something's working. So I'm going to try something else. I'm going to close my terminal window, my SSH channel to that host. I'm going to try it again, only this time when I set up the SSH channel, I'm going to direct port 8080 on my local host and tunnel through to port 8080 . Alright, so I've set up a tunnel between port 8080 on my local host and port 8080 on the server. Now I should be able to point my browser at just localhost, and even though I'm not running Tomcat here, it uses that tunnel, and there is VitroLib, which we have set up. So I have one more item on my agenda, and that is to go to my system administrator and ask him to open that port on the firewall. But for now, by using check things out. So that's the end of the installation and the end of this video. I hope you find it helpful.